Hello friends, and welcome to the second and final part of Fortunately's series about the student loan debt issue. Make sure to check out the first part if you haven't already, since in this video we'll be discussing the plausibility and fairness of student loan debt forgiveness. So without any further ado, on with the show! Student loans work by sucking out your soul and replacing it with stress and tears and unhappiness. This is a comment we stumbled upon that perfectly sums up the sentiments of most people who have taken out a student loan and are now struggling to repay it. Millennials hold the not-so-coveted title of the most indebted students of all time. Congratulations, guys, you've really earned it. It's more than obvious that student loan debt is as much of a burden to our society as it is to each individual who suffers from it. In fact, the current economic crisis caused by the global pandemic has brought the idea of student loan debt forgiveness into the mainstream, so much so that it has been a major topic of debate during recent electoral campaigns in the USA. So, what can we expect in the following years regarding student loan debt forgiveness? Can we dare to dream that we'll ever be completely rid of this awful burden? Could complete student loan forgiveness ever be possible? And if so, would that be fair? Let's entertain the thought. Student loan debt forgiveness actually already exists, but only in an extremely limited form. Indeed, around 99% of student loan forgiveness applicants get rejected, so the current system seems very inefficient, if not completely useless. Looking at those figures, most of us would agree that student loan forgiveness programs need some serious alterations if we want them to do any noticeable good. During his electoral campaign, President Joe Biden made some proposals that could take an awful lot of pressure off students and graduates. These included doubling the maximum value of Pell Grants, free tuition for community colleges, and an improved public service loan forgiveness program. The most direct proposed measure is federal debt cancellation of up to $10,000 per borrower. The Trump-led Republicans made it clear that they would never have allowed that legislation to pass through the Senate. However, with Democrat candidates winning both Senate runoff races in Georgia on the 5th of January, the Senate is now split 50-50, and Vice President Kamala Harris has the deciding vote. As such, the Democrats effectively have control of the presidency, the House, and the Senate. That doesn't necessarily mean legislation would fly through. After all, Democrats would need a 60-40 majority to quash debate on the issue. But if it does somehow sneak through, this bold move would wipe out debt for nearly 15 million individuals who owe $10,000 or less, effectively cutting the country's staggering $1.7 trillion student loan tab by a third. Yes, observant viewer, it's true. Total student loan debt has indeed risen that much since our previous video. In fact, it's now getting close to a staggering $1.8 trillion. Ever-growing tuition costs have snowballed over decades. It really makes you wonder whether all those students were, and still are, under some kind of spell for agreeing to pay more and more each year for the exact same thing. How have colleges managed to pull that off? Well, we'll put it this way. Imagine you own a business and you offer services of a sort. Let's say you do tarot readings and you need to decide how much to charge for them. You'll probably determine the price of a reading by not going too far above or below the industry standard. After all, you don't want your customers to turn to the competition for a better deal. But check this out. What if money wasn't an issue for anyone interested in tarot readings? What if tarot customers specifically had an infinite amount of money to spend? You and your competitors would be idiots not to crank up the price as much as possible, right? And that's exactly what colleges did and keep doing. They know there's no limit to how much debt students can take on. And since there's nothing stopping students from borrowing, tuition fees will likely keep rising. In turn, more and more people will be unable to pay their debt off. It's clear that something must be done about this warped system, and cancelling student loan debt seems like the most obvious solution. So why hasn't it been done already? Here's a quick breakdown. First of all, we need to remember that not all student loans are federal. Around 7% are private, and these aren't going anywhere, no matter what the government decides. Of course, solving the problem for 93% of debtors is still a considerable achievement, so let's see where the obstacle lies. Even if you're a federal student loan borrower, your debt might not belong to the government. It's very likely that it's actually owned by another institution, guaranteed by a different one, and possibly serviced by a fourth or even a fifth agency. How come? Well, after a loan is issued, it immediately becomes an asset that can be bought and sold on the market. It's in the interest of banks to sell them to another intermediary because doing so immediately increases their capital ratio, allowing them to give out even more loans. This means that student loan debt can't ever simply be erased, not by Biden, the US government, or anyone else. So even if, in some pipe dream scenario, the government decided to cancel all existing debt, it would also have to finance its repayment to all those agencies and intermediaries. To do so, the government would have to raise taxes, which are, of course, paid by the people. Some people argue that the government could simply print out money, just as it did during the economic downfall caused by COVID-19. The capacity for this exists. However, that would require printing an enormous amount of money, and it would probably just reinforce a broken system. And there are other undesired consequences of printing unbacked money. That could be the subject of a whole other video, but we won't go there now. Then there's the problem of what to do about those people who have already paid their loans off. Should the government just write them a check? Or should we expect them to be selfless enough to forget about years and years of financial struggle? How likely is that to happen, especially during the current economic crisis? And here's another ethical issue to consider. Should the government then give adequate compensation to all those people who decided not to go to college because they couldn't afford any kind of debt? They would probably have had a better education and a more successful career if they'd known their debt would be forgiven. Finally, even if this enormous debt disappears overnight, how long would it take to get right back where we are? If tuition fees keep growing faster than inflation rates, students will simply keep taking out loans they can't afford, probably hoping that their loan will be forgiven sometime in the future. So many questions, moral issues, and problems, and the debt keeps piling up by the minute. Is there a reasonable solution? Or can something at least be done to stop this debt from growing even more? Well, some experts argue that as long as students can borrow an unlimited amount of money, they will keep accumulating debt that they can't pay off, and the vicious cycle will continue. These same people suggest that the only incentive for colleges and individuals to focus on controlling costs is putting a limit on how much money can be borrowed for education, both by individuals and their parents. The accent here is really on parents, since plus loans are currently unlimited. At first glance, it seems like this move would only stop poverty-stricken people from getting into colleges, thus widening the class gap. However, if it were done in each state, this would force both students and colleges to consider the costs and ROI of dollars spent. We should remember that colleges are under a lot of pressure as well. To stay competitive, they're basically forced to spend money on fancy campus upgrades that look great but don't necessarily improve education. Colleges aren't entirely to blame for our current predicament. There's a much bigger vicious cycle at play here. The only long-term solution might be simply limiting the amount of money that circulates in the US higher education system, thus forcing both sides to take a huge step back and play their part in wiping the slate clean. We can only hope that we'll see an end to this crisis sometime soon. In the meantime, even partial debt forgiveness remains a fairly slim hope unless the two parties can reach some kind of bipartisan agreement. And if you're waiting for some significant systematic change that would get to the very root of the problem, don't hold your breath.